Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hey there, welcome back to Unbound, Season 3, The Other Side of Quiet. I'm Beth. In today's chapter, I guess I'm stepping into one of the most complicated crossroads of my life. The moment I had to choose between the love that had held my past together and the love that was pulling me toward a future I never expected. I guess it's a chapter about honesty and heartbreak and the quiet courage it takes to move forward when your whole history is tugging you back. This is chapter 14 in the book, Choosing Forward. The hardest conversations are the ones where you have to tell someone you love that you're choosing a different kind of love. The week after meeting Brian, I walked around in a fog of guilt and confusion, replaying our conversations over and over while simultaneously dreading the phone call I knew I had to make to Nate. Because that's what meeting Brian had done. It had clarified something I'd been trying not to see for months. What Nate and I had was real and deep and built on true love, shared trauma, and genuine care for each other. But what I felt when I talked to Brian was something entirely different. Lightness, possibility, the sense I could be someone new instead of someone trying to recover from who I'd been. Nate represented healing from my past. Brian represented moving forward to a future I'd never imagined. And as much as I loved Nate, as much as I would always love Nate, I realized I needed to choose the future over the past. I called Brian first, 3 days after our meeting. I told myself it was just to see if the connection I'd felt was real or if I'd imagined it in the aftermath of a good night and too much to drink. But really, I called because I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I needed to know if he was thinking about me too. He was. We talked for hours again, just like that first phone call, about all kinds of things, about movies and music and ridiculous Halloween decorations that were still up all over town, about work and family and the random thoughts that pop into your head when you're trying to fall asleep at night. It was easy in a way that felt almost suspicious. After years of relationships that required nonstop negotiation and careful emotional management, talking to Brian felt effortless. When we hung up, he asked if I wanted to get together later that week. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. And that's when I knew I had to have the conversation with Nate that I'd been avoiding. I met Nate at the coffee shop where we'd had so many conversations over the past 2 years. The place where we'd rebuilt our friendship, where we'd talked through our grief, where we'd planned our future together just a few months earlier. He knew something was wrong the moment he saw me. He'd always been able to read my moods better than anyone. I told him about Brian. Not everything, not in the way my heart sped up when Brian laughed, not in the way I'd felt more like myself in 3 hours with him than I had in months of trying to rebuild what Nate and I used to have. But enough. Enough that Nate understood what I was really saying. Nate was quiet for a bit after I finished talking. He stirred his coffee and looked out the window and took deep breaths like he was trying to process information that didn't quite make sense. Finally, he said the thing I'd been afraid he would say. I thought we were building something together. I thought we were finally ready to try again. And we had been. We were. That was what made this so fucking complicated. We were, I said. We are. I don't know. I'm confused. What do you need? He asked, because even in the middle of what had to be devastating news, Nate was trying to take care of me. Do you need time to figure this out? Do you need space to explore whatever this is with him? I wanted to say yes. That's exactly what I needed. Time and space and permission to see if what I felt with Brian was real or just the excitement of something new. But that felt like asking Nate to wait around while I auditioned his replacement. And he deserved better than that. I said slowly, I think I need to see where this goes. And I think that means I can't keep planning a future with you while I'm doing that. Nate nodded like he'd been expecting this, even though I could see how much it hurt him. I understand, he said. I don't like it, but I understand. We sat there for a long time after that, neither of us knowing what to say. Our coffees had gone cold. The cafe was starting to empty out for the evening. I wanted to reach across the table and hold his hand, but that felt cruel. I wanted to tell him that I still loved him, but that felt even crueler. "I'm sorry," I said finally, and my voice broke on the words. "I know," he said. "Me too." Tears were streaming down my face by then. Nate's eyes were red, but he wasn't crying. He was holding it together in the way he always had, being strong even when everything was falling apart. "I hate this," I said. "I hate that I'm hurting you. I hate that after everything we've been through, this is how it ends." "It's not ending," he said quietly. "We're just changing. We'll still be friends. We'll still be in each other's lives, just differently." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I believed him. How do you stay friends with someone whose heart you just broke? When we finally stood to leave, when we walked out to the parking lot together one last time, Nate pulled me into a hug. "Be happy," he whispered against my hair. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." And then he let me go. I watched him walk to his car, watched him drive away, and felt like I was watching the last piece of my old life disappear. When I got home, there was a message from him. "I really want you to be happy, Beth, even if that's not with me." Breaking up with someone you love because you've fallen for someone else is a special kind of cruelty. You're not ending things because they hurt you, or because you've grown apart, or because the relationship isn't working. You're ending things because your heart decided to want something different, and hearts are notoriously bad at timing and consideration for other people's feelings. Nate and I didn't have a dramatic breakup. We'd been through too much together for that. We just acknowledged that the future we'd been planning wasn't going to happen yet, if at all, and we tried to figure out how to be friends again without the possibility of romance hanging between us. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, and also one of the most necessary. Because staying with Nate would have been the safe choice, the choice that made sense to everyone who knew our history. But it would have been a choice based on gratitude and shared trauma rather than the kind of love that makes you excited about tomorrow. I mean, we did have that, but the other stuff was there too. I needed to choose excitement over safety, possibility over certainty, the unknown over the familiar. I needed to choose Brian. What followed was the most natural relationship progression I'd ever experienced. Brian and I started spending time together, real quality time, not the careful loaded interactions I'd got used to with Nate. We went to movies and tried new restaurants and spent hours just walking around the city, just talking. He made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten I could laugh, not the careful, grateful laughter of someone who's learning to be happy again, but the unself-conscious surprise laughter of someone who's genuinely enjoying herself. Brian didn't know about my trauma history at first, and there was something liberating about being with someone who saw me as I was now, rather than someone recovering from what had happened to her before. I told him about Brandon early on. Not everything, but enough. We were maybe a month into dating, sitting in his car after dinner, and something he said reminded me of something from that time. The words just started coming out. "I need to tell you something," I said, "about my past, about something that happened to me." I told him about the rape, about Brandon, about being trapped and afraid and not knowing how to escape. I didn't go into much detail. I just said it matter-of-factly. I stated it more like I was in an abusive relationship and he hit me around when I wouldn't have sex with him. Brian didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it or tell me how strong I was. He just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me. That must have been really hard to share." Not, "I'm sorry that happened to you," though he said that too, later. Just acknowledging that telling him had taken courage. Cure came later. We were in Jamaica on vacation, and I'd had a few drinks, enough to lower the walls I'd usually kept up around that story. Brian had been drinking too, and I'm not even sure he fully registered what I was telling him. The next day, he didn't mention it, and I didn't bring it up again. It wasn't until the pandemic, years later, when everything was falling apart and all my old trauma was resurfacing, that I told him the whole story properly. I told him and my aunt on my front porch, both of them listening as I finally spoke all the words I'd been holding for decades. I cried hard. They supported quietly. Brian hugged me and said, "I'm sorry." And just recently I shared Kier's picture with both Brian and crew, and again Brian supported and said, "I'm so sorry." But even in those early days, even with only pieces of the story, Brian understood enough. He knew I carried things I couldn't always talk about, and he made space for that without demanding I explain everything before he could love me. When I did eventually tell him about Brandon, about Kier, about the years of therapy and self-destruction and careful rebuilding, he listened without trying to fix anything or offer advice or tell me how strong I was for surviving it. It was always just simple acknowledgement that meant more than all the well-meaning attempts to find meaning or silver linings in my pain. Brian didn't need my trauma to make sense. He didn't need it to have taught me valuable lessons or made me stronger or happened for a reason. He could just let it be what it was, a terrible thing that had happened to someone he cared about. That acceptance felt like a gift I didn't know I needed. We were together for 9 months before Brian asked me to marry him. It wasn't a fancy and elaborate proposal. We were on his penthouse balcony during a thunderstorm. I don't even remember what he said. I should have been surprised. We'd been together less than a year. We were both still young. We hadn't talked about marriage in any super serious way. But he did tell me there was a ring, his great-grandfather's ring. But instead of surprise, I felt recognition, like he was naming something I'd already known but hadn't quite put into words yet. I said yes. And that was it. A ring, but no grand gesture, no months of planning and wondering and second-guessing. Just two people who'd found something good together and wanted to keep it. We got married 14 months after we started dating, with our families and closest friends. It was simple and joyful and felt exactly right, in a way that nothing in my life had felt right for years. Nate did come to the wedding, but he sat in the back. He signed the guest book and gave us a card that said, "Wishing you all the happiness you deserve." Because even in heartbreak, Nate was kind. The thing about marrying someone you meet when you're in the process of healing is that you get to grow up together in ways that people who meet when they're already fully formed don't get to experience. Brian knew me as someone who was working on herself, someone who was figuring out who she wanted to be rather than someone who already had it all figured out. And I got to know him as someone who was patient with that process, someone who could love a work in progress. We built our relationship on who we were becoming rather than who we'd been before we met each other, and that made all the difference. The early years of our marriage were about learning to build a life together while I continued the work of healing. It wasn't always easy. I still had bad days. I still struggled with anxiety and depression and the lingering effects of trauma. I still had to work hard to unlearn the patterns that trauma had taught me about relationships and self-worth and trust. I picked a lot of fights with him too. I was incredibly insecure, and I didn't trust him very much early on. But Brian made space for all of that without making it the centerpiece of our relationship. He could hold my history without being defined by it. He could support my healing without making it his job to fix me. And slowly, carefully, I learned what it felt like to be loved for who I was, rather than in spite of who I had been. We wanted children, of course. Started trying not long after we got married, full of the optimism that comes with being young and in love and believing that good things will happen because you deserve them. But months passed, then years, and nothing happened. In 2002, after countless tests and procedures and conversations with specialists, we were told what we'd already started to suspect. We probably wouldn't be able to have children. The news should have devastated me, and it did in some ways, but there was also a strange kind of relief in finally having an answer, in knowing that the waiting and hoping and monthly disappointments could finally end. We talked about adoption or fostering and other ways to build a family, about the possibility that maybe they would just be the two of us and that could be enough. But fate, as it seemed, had other plans. In 2004, against all odds and medical predictions, I got pregnant. And then, at 14 weeks, I lost the baby. The loss was devastating in ways I hadn't expected, not just because of the pregnancy itself, but because of everything it represented. Hope after years of being told hope was pointless, possibility after years of accepting this particular dream wasn't meant for us. That loss deserves its own chapter, its own space to be witnessed and understood, because what happened next, the pregnancy that came after, the timing that had to be exactly right, the way that experience changed everything, that's a story that needs to be told properly, But for now, it's enough to say that Brian and I learned together what it meant to hold hope and grief simultaneously, to want something desperately while knowing that wanting it didn't guarantee you'd get to keep it. People sometimes ask me if I ever wonder what would have happened if I stayed with Nate, if I'd chosen the love that was built on shared history rather than the love that was built on shared possibility. The honest answer is yes. Sometimes I do wonder. Nate became a doctor like he'd always planned, but he never married or had children. He dedicated his life to his work, pouring all the love and care he might have given to a family into healing other people. We stayed friends through all these years. It hasn't always been easy. There have been ups and downs, complicated moments, times when the weight of our history made friendship feel impossible. And I hurt him again, more than once, including bringing someone I once trusted and cared for into his world, who ended up causing him deep pain. Even with how careful I always was to never allow my circles to ever merge, in order to avoid anyone I loved being hurt, I still managed to do that. And he was hurt. I can't undo that either. I can't take back the ways my choices continue to ripple through his life long after I'd chosen Brian. Most people would have walked away. They would have decided that the cost of staying in my orbit was too high, that I'd proven too many times that I was dangerous to the people who loved me. They should have. But Nate never did. He kept showing up. He kept choosing to be in my life even when I'd given him every reason to choose otherwise. He kept loving me in all the ways that changed and evolved, and with the kind of profound, unconditional care that transcends romantic love entirely. I don't know if that makes him a different breed of human, or if it makes me one for being unable to fully destroy something so good, even when I tried. Maybe it makes us both different. Him for his capacity to forgive, me for my willingness to let him forgive me instead of running from the shame of what I'd done. What I do know is this: Nate's continued presence in my life, his refusal to let hurt have the final word, his ability to see me as worthy of love even when I couldn't see it myself, that might be one of the greatest gifts I've ever received. Not because it absolves me of the pain I caused him. It doesn't. But because it taught me that people are more complex than the things that they do, that love can survive even catastrophic hurt if both people are willing to do the work, that grace is real and possible, even in the messiest of circumstances. But we've navigated it together, and now decades later, we're closer than we've ever been. The pandemic brought a lot of old wounds to the surface for me, not just the fresh trauma of global uncertainty, but echoes of everything I'd survived before. The bullying, the silencing, the feeling of being trapped and powerless. Suddenly I was reliving patterns I thought I'd healed from, remembering fears I thought I'd overcome. And Nate was there through all of it, understanding in ways that only someone who'd lived through it with me could understand. He knew exactly why certain triggers hit so hard, why some days felt impossible to navigate, why the past sometimes crashes into the present without warning. Having that kind of witness to your history, that kind of understanding friendship, is a gift I never expected to receive. I hope Nate knows that choosing Brian wasn't about him not being enough. It was about me needing something different than what we could have given each other at that time in our lives. I had to choose between honoring my past and embracing my future. I chose the future, and it turned out to be more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. The girl who'd survived Brandon's abuse, who'd lost her first baby to violence, who'd spent years convinced she was too damaged for real love, she got to have the happy ending after all. Not because she was rescued by someone else, but because she learned to rescue herself. Not because she forgot what had happened to her, but because she chose to build something new on top of what had been broken. The trauma didn't disappear when I married Brian. The grief didn't magically resolve when our son was born. The work of healing didn't end just because my life got happier. But the trauma stopped being the most important thing about me. It became part of my story instead of the whole story. And that made all the difference. If you're reading this from a place of pain, wondering if it's possible to build something beautiful after something terrible has happened to you, please know that it is possible. Not because trauma makes you stronger or happens for a reason or any of that bullshit, but because humans are remarkably resilient, because love is real, because hope is not naive. Your trauma doesn't disqualify you from happiness. Your past doesn't determine your future. Your scars don't make you unworthy of love. You get to choose what comes next. You get to decide whether your story is defined by what happened to you or by what you choose to do with what happened to you. Choose the future, choose hope, choose love. You deserve it all. Epilogue to a friendship. There's one more thing that needs to be said about Nate, about the kind of love that survives everything. I hurt him in ways I can never fully repair. I chose Brian when Nate had just lost both of his parents. I brought someone into his world who hurt him deeply. I've been selfish and scared and unable to love him the way he deserved to be loved, over and over across decades. And he's still here. Not out of obligation or guilt, or because he's waiting for something that might happen, but because somewhere along the way we figured out how to build a friendship that holds all of it. The love, the loss, the hurt, the healing, the epic fuck-ups, and the forgiveness. I don't know what I did to deserve that kind of grace. I suspect the answer is nothing. That grace, by definition, is unearned. But I know what it's taught me, that the people we hurt aren't defined by our capacity to hurt them, and we aren't defined by the worst things we've done to people we love. My mom said that a lot throughout her life. It also taught me that repair is possible, even when forgiveness seems impossible. That love can transform into something different without disappearing entirely. Nate could have walked away a dozen times. He should have, probably. He would have been justified in deciding I wasn't worth the continued pain of being in my orbit. Instead, he chose to stay, to keep showing up, to love me in whatever form that love needed to take to survive. That's not weakness or codependency or an inability to set boundaries. That's a conscious choice to believe that connection matters more than perfection, that history is worth preserving, even when it's complicated, that people are worth fighting for, even when they've hurt you. I think about that sometimes, about how different my life would be if Nate had made the completely reasonable decision to cut me out of his life after I chose Brian. If he decided that protecting himself meant walking away from someone who'd proven she could hurt him, I wouldn't blame him if he had. I blamed myself enough for both of us. But he didn't walk away. And because he didn't, I got to learn something I might not have learned otherwise, that I was capable of maintaining love without destroying it, that I could be present in someone's life without being toxic to their well-being, that the person I'd been at my worst wasn't the only person I could be. Nate gave me that, not by rescuing me or fixing me or loving me back to health, but by refusing to let my worst moments define our entire story. That's the kind of friend everyone deserves, and few people find. If you're reading this, Nate, and I suspect you will eventually, thank you for staying, for forgiving, for seeing me as more than my mistakes, for teaching me what unconditional love actually looks like, even when it's not wrapped up in romance or obligation. For being the kind of person who makes me want to be better, not out of guilt, but out of genuine desire to be worthy of your continued presence in my life. I hope you know that choosing Brian wasn't about you not being enough. You were always enough. You were always more than enough. And his respect and acceptance of your place in my life is something he also understands you deserve, simply because of who you are. I just needed to become someone who could receive that kind of love before I could sustain it, and by the time I'd become that person, I'd already chosen a different path. But the love didn't disappear, it just transformed into something that could survive all of us. I really think this is a miracle. Not that we loved each other once, but that we figured out how to keep loving each other through everything that came after. Looking back now, what strikes me most about this chapter isn't the decision itself. It's the cost of making it, honestly. Choosing Brian didn't feel brave at the time. It felt like failure, like I was betraying someone who had loved me when loving me wasn't easy. Like I was walking away from a version of myself I fought really fucking hard to rebuild, I didn't feel empowered or clear or courageous. I felt sick to my stomach, heavy with guilt and deeply afraid of what my choice said about who I was. And I think you can tell in my reading that I still feel sadness because I think, I try to put myself in Nate's shoes. And I think about how much that would have hurt me if it was the other way around. And it's so hard to live with the knowledge that you hurt someone so bad. And at the time, for what felt like selfish reasons, he's such a good guy. And I love him so much. And I hate that I hurt him so many times. Anyway, for a long time, I believed that choosing forward meant erasing what came before. That moving forward toward a future required diminishing the past. But I see now how wrong that was. But I was a kid. I was 21. I didn't really understand that growth can actually include grief and that love can transform without disappearing. And that endings don't have to turn people into villains. What I was really choosing between wasn't two men. It was those two identities that I had built. With Nate, I was the girl who survived something unimaginable, and I learned how to keep breathing afterward. And our love was forged in grief and in loyalty and these shared memories and stuff. There was safety there, but also a constant orientation toward what we had lost. And with Brian, I was this woman I was becoming. I wasn't healed, I wasn't fixed, but I was no longer kind of living entirely inside survival, Psychologically, this is something we don't talk a lot about. Trauma doesn't just shape who we love, it shapes how we choose as well. When you've lived in crisis, your nervous system clings to what's familiar, even when familiar isn't nourishing anymore. Nate felt like home, and he still does. He is home. He's just such a huge part of my heart and my life. Brian felt like open space, and open space can be terrifying when you've learned that anything good can disappear without warning. And Brian is also such a huge part of my heart. And I'm so blessed to have these. I have 3 men in my life who I'm just so grateful for. What I didn't have language for then, but understand very clearly now, is that ease was information. That fact that I didn't have to explain myself constantly. The fact that my body relaxed instead of kind of tensed up or braced. And the fact that love didn't feel like work or vigilance or some sort of emotional triage, right? That wasn't luck. That was just my nervous system recognizing safety for the first time in a long time. But safety doesn't erase loyalty. And this is the part I still sit with, decades later. I hurt Nate more than once. I hurt him by choosing someone else. I hurt him by not being as honest or as clean as I wish I had been. I hurt him later in ways I couldn't have predicted and I cannot undo. And there is no version of this story where I get to claim innocence at all. And yet what humbles me the most, of course, is that he stayed. Initially, not romantically, not waiting, not hoping, but present, choosing friendship and choosing complexity and choosing to love me in a way that didn't demand repayment or redemption at all. Nate taught me that grace isn't passive. It's an active, conscious decision to refuse to let pain be the final chapter. The relationship, what it became, it challenged everything I thought I knew about love. I had believed that once you hurt someone badly enough, you forfeited the right to stay in their life. But Nate showed me that sometimes love doesn't end, it just changes form. And that change doesn't mean the original love was flawed. It means it was real enough to evolve. And we've definitely evolved now. Choosing Brian wasn't about Nate not being enough. He was more than enough. It was about me needing a different kind of love at a specific moment in my life, one that didn't require me to live in the past to be understood. Brian didn't heal me. He didn't save me. What he did was give me space to continue becoming without demanding I finish healing first. That matters. Because so many people believe they have to be done before they deserve love. That they need to resolve every wound, silence every trigger, package their pain neatly before they're allowed to move forward. That's not how healing works at all. Healing often happens inside relationships that feel safe enough to hold imperfection, right? Choosing forward didn't erase my trauma at all. It didn't magically fix my nervous system or rewrite my history. I still struggled. I still fought. I still carried fear and insecurity into my marriage. But my trauma stopped being the organizing principle of my life, if that makes sense. It became part of the landscape, not the whole fucking terrain. And that's the distinction that I hope listeners hear. If you're standing at these crossroads right now, between loyalty and truth, and between safety and possibility, and between who you've been and who you're becoming, I want you to know that choosing forward is not betrayal. It's just survival evolving into living. You can honor what saved you and choose what grows you. And you can love deeply and let go. And you can cause harm and still be worthy of grace. The future I chose didn't come without loss, but it came with expansion. And in the end, that expansion made room not just for romantic love, but for friendship, forgiveness, and a deeper understanding of what it means to heal. I think that one of the bravest things you could do is stop living backward and just trust that the version of you who's emerging totally deserves a chance to exist. Thank you so much for being here for this episode. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me, so when new episodes come out, you will be notified. You can rate and review on most of the platforms, and I would also appreciate that because it gets my work out there. It really helps me. All episodes of Unbound are free. If you want to support the production costs, you can find me on Ko-fi, but there's never any obligation. Content will always be free. Support and contact info is in the show notes. And if you join the Facebook group, we often have further conversation there. I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.